Finally finished my thesis, and I'm pretty excited about that. So, what's going on, guys? It's Josh here, and it is, I do believe, November 12th. Yeah, November 12th. Uh, Sorry that I look kind of like mangy at the moment. It's been a pretty stressful week, and I didn't get off work until about 2 hours ago, and I went for a jog downtown after work just to kind of clear my head because like I said, it's been a pretty stressful week. However, this isn't like a training video or anything. It's just kind of an update on my research paper for my history degree. But just to start at the beginning, for those of you who don't know who I am or what I do, I am a history and originally, I was a history and biology double major at Hanover College. I came into Hanover in 2016, but I took, it was about, in credit hours, it was about 33 credit hours of college credit my senior year of high school. I attended Madison Consolidated High School, and I went through their AP dual credit program that they had, which was essentially, you could graduate with a full year of college by your senior year, and so I did. The only prerequisites for that was that you had to maintain over 3.0 GPA, which is not that bad for high school. I applied to 4 different universities. I applied to IU Bloomington in Southeast, Hanover College. Northwestern sent me a bunch of shit in the mail, but I never applied to them because I kind of figured that my high school GPA was like 3.34, so I kind of figured that there was no way that I was going to get into Northwestern anyways. And I might have already said this, but then I applied to University of Louisville, and then I applied to Hanover. Hanover was the first one that actually answered my application, and then they had kind of like a career/college day out at Madison, and I was relatively impressed with what I saw. I met a couple of the professors that I now actually have for classes, and they seemed like good people, and I was really impressed with the smaller atmosphere. It's a non-research college, and so basically your class sizes range anywhere from the smallest that I've had is 4 people, all the way up to the largest that I've had was a advanced nutrition class, and that was 46. Okay, that's not right. The largest class that I've had at Hanover is my genetics class currently, and that has 59 people in it. So it's a relatively small college, especially compared to University of Louisville and IU Bloomington, which has dozens to hundreds of kids in one lecture. And it was close to home, so I could just commute and save about $20,000 in room and board fees. And so to me, it seemed like a really good deal. And so I chose to go to Hanover College. They gave me around, in just academic scholarships alone, I got around $33,000 from Hanover. And then in federal grants and other anonymous scholarships, I pretty much had my tuition covered. So it was essentially a free ride to a private liberal arts college that I could just commute to. And so I could hold a part-time job, and that to me was just really appealing. So I went into Hanover College as a sophomore, which led to issues earlier. But anyways, that's another video. My sophomore year, I declared that I wanted to be a history and biology major, which now, as things sit, I'm just a history major with a boatload of additional units and content exposure in the sciences. Right now, my GPA sits at around 3.47, which isn't exactly where I wanted to be. I had a couple of bad prerequisite courses. But it is my senior year. I am set to graduate in May, and as it sits, I took the historical research class winter term. So Hanover does terms, fall term, which is September to December 19th, and then winter term, which is January 9th, 10th to the end of April, and then we have something called spring term. I apologize, I'm losing my voice. It's like snowing and shit outside, and it was 60 degrees like 2 days ago, so my allergies are acting up. But, and then spring term runs just the last month of May. It's a 4-week course. And so basically, I took the junior seminar class, winter term of my senior year. And the purpose of that class was to essentially create a prospectus, get a general idea of what you wanted to write your thesis over, and approach an advisor within the history department and get an okay for your topic, and kind of get like a roadmap slash outline of where you wanted to go with the topic. Winter term of my sophomore year, I had taken a course known as what was it? It was History 366: Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And essentially, it was a course that started off with some of the earlier writings, so Herodian Dio. There was some Tacitus, there was some Suetonius. I mean, we even went back to early Greek, or later Greek with Thucydides and shit like that, and we read portions of the Aeneid. And then we worked through to Burckhardt, Brown, Gibbon, Perrin, and the like. So we essentially started with the Augustan age, and we went all the way through to through the good emperors, the Julian Claudian dynasty, the Severan dynasty, crisis of the 3rd century, the Barracks emperors, Diocletian, the formalization of the Dominate, Constantine, the rise of Christianity, and that's essentially where the course ended. But during that course, when we actually got to the topic of the Barracks emperors, I remember reading in Gibbon about the, quote, famous prince, Aurelian. And so I read the chapter, and I immediately became fascinated by this individual's kind of just achievements and accomplishments. And so I knew then that if I was going to declare a history major, because I was still relatively undecided when I was taking that class as to whether I just wanted to be kinesiology, integrative physiology major with a biology minor, or biology with a history degree. I ended up going with history, and so I pretty much had it in my mind that I wanted to do Aurelian in the crisis of the 3rd century. Well, I wanted to do something on Aurelian. I didn't know the aspects of the 3rd century yet. And so I approached my history advisor, Dr. Daniel Murphy Jr., who is a Northwestern graduate who specializes in American cultural history, military history, world military history, and American politics and social patterns in the late 20th and early 19th century. Weird combination, but he's a really cool guy, really sharp guy. He's honestly my favorite professor out of Hanover, and so I approached him with this research topic, and he was really excited to do it. He said it's an immensely fascinating topic. He made sure that I understood that for me to actually write a decent research paper on this, I was going to have to go through a lot of the primary sources, a lot of which either came from the Loeb Classical Library or probably going to be in another language. Luckily for me, I can't remember who actually does this. I think H.W. Bird is the one that does a lot of the translations for a lot of the 3rd century, 4th, and 5th century sources on the 3rd century Roman Empire and the crisis era, but I was able to find pretty much all the sources that I needed to at least get started on my thesis, and they were all in English, so that was really helpful. He recommended some books as well, and I purchased all of them. I didn't want to keep going back to the library because I did have a part-time job, and I do still train pretty heartily with powerlifting, and so I didn't have much time to sit in a library for hours on end, and I knew that I was going to have to take summer classes that term to fulfill a prerequisite course I didn't get done for to take genetics my senior year. So I bought all the books the summer of my junior year. So it was decided that I was going to do something on Aurelian, and so essentially the working title of my thesis was just Aurelian, the Restorer of the World. And so I purchased all the books. I think I started with Eutropius, Eusebius, Lactantius, John White's book, the biography of Aurelian, Alaric Watson's book, another biography of Aurelian. Christopher Scare had kind of a more general outline of most of the Roman emperors. I think it was called like the history of, or the chronological history of the Roman emperors or something akin to that. I'm sure it's like right behind me somewhere. I'm just too lazy to fucking turn around and look at it. But the other ones, I think that there was another account of the Roman emperors by Michael Grant, who was a little bit more of a serious scholar in the Roman histories, and so I really wanted his biographical skills, and he has pretty in-depth sections on every emperor. I think his book ends up being like 700 pages, and it's in multiple parts. So that was like the first round of books that I bought. Eventually, after I bought the first round of books, and while I was down in Bloomington taking my summer courses, I ended up purchasing Zanaris, Zosimus, Zanaris, Aurelius Victor, Origin, or Oregon, I never really knew how to say that, and, I ended up purchasing Saunders' PhD thesis on Aurelian from the University of Michigan. It was like $9. I mean, it wasn't anything too spectacularly expensive. I didn't start, so I started to write my paper, but just to give a general overview of what I actually wrote my paper on, as I started reading the primary sources, it became clear to me that if I was just going to write a paper on Aurelian, it was essentially going to devolve into a biography. There wasn't exactly any research that I was doing, and any conclusions that I came to are conclusions that haven't necessarily been came to by any other author, especially Alaric Watson. I honestly think that his book is well worth the read if anybody hasn't read it. It is a great overview of the 3rd century, the Barracks Emperors, and particularly Aurelian, and a lot of his policies. But anyways, that's away from the point. So pretty quickly, especially after I had gotten through Alaric's book and was getting about halfway through White's book and reading sections of Aurelius Victor, and Gibbon. Oh, yeah. Gibbon was in there, too. I bought Gibbon's book as well. The first part of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So I was reading through this, and it became pretty clear that if I was just going to do Aurelian, it wasn't necessarily going to be a research paper. It was essentially going to be a regurgitory biography, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do a research paper. I mean, I have aspirations to go to grad school. I have aspirations to pursue a degree in history, or do something in history, potentially, if I don't go to grad school for other science-related things. And so I came to the conclusion that what I was going to do is that I was going to do essentially a 2-part thesis. I was going to write my thesis as kind of like a build-up. So the build-up, essentially, the introductory portion was going to be an introduction to the 3rd century. So I was going to introduce the 3rd century as it was. So, like, we're leaving the Julia Claudian, we're leaving the good emperors, and we're going into the early Severan dynasty with Septimus Severus. That's where I started, was with Septimus Severus. And then we're going to work all the way through to Valerian, Claudius, Gallienus, Quintillus, until we get essentially to the reign of Aurelian. What I was going to do is that there are plenty of details or accounts of the crisis of the 3rd century, but there isn't necessarily, aside from Saunders' PhD thesis and more or less sections of Watson books, there hasn't necessarily been a devout or devoted research paper as to how exactly the integral parts of the Roman Empire, or how the history of the Roman Empire, or how the decisions and policies of the many emperors across the period of leading into the 3rd century had actually accounted for and led to the elements of the crisis era that became so pernicious in the 3rd century that it became what we know as the crisis era, the military anarchy crisis, as Rorschach and Watson and Jigaja eventually come to call it. So what I wanted to do is that the first part of my paper, I wanted to be a research and kind of presentation aspect, to where I was going to go through the 3rd century from Septimus Severus all the way to Aurelian, and essentially go through the beginning and how it was, and introduce all the elements of the crisis era that eventually overlapped, conglomerated, until we actually get to what I call, in my paper, come to the conclusion is the first fall of the Roman Empire, which is in 279, I think it was either 279 or 276, after Zenobia decides to secede from the Roman Empire. So just to do a quick run-through of what exactly happened in the crisis of the 3rd century, and what exactly is the crisis of the 3rd century. So essentially speaking, the cornerstone aspect of the crisis of the 3rd century can be traced back to Augustus. When he came to power and established the Principate, what he had essentially done was expanded the Roman Empire to what we were most commonly associated with the Roman Empire. However, what he didn't do, and all that he did do, what he didn't do was establish a clear line of succession with his reign. He had exiled Tacitus? Who was the kid fucker? Tacitus. So he didn't want Tacitus to actually come to the throne. He didn't trust Tacitus. He didn't like Tacitus. At one point, Augustus actually had exiled Tacitus. However, it's thought that Livia had actually killed his kids, and that they weren't actually old enough to kind of hereditarily inherit the Principate from him, and the Senate technically did have power to name the next princeps. And so they elected Tacitus, which leads to issues later, because the problem with that is that if the empire doesn't have a de facto legislative aspect by which you can definitively choose emperors, or a set of characteristics or a set of parameters by which you go about choosing the next emperors, what's eventually going to happen is that individuals are going to come to power, or you're going to have issues later when individuals contest the other individuals that you bring to power. And so another aspect leading into this issue of secession was that the military throughout the 2nd century, 3rd century, and late 2nd century began to devolve, not necessarily devolve, but become far more cognizant of how much power they actually possessed within the context of the empire itself. Well, what does that mean? So essentially speaking, individuals who became hopeful to the thrones, and so this is the early aspects of the Barracks Emperor's issues, what would start to happen is these individuals would win battles that gain support of local legions of troops or local groups of troops of legionnaires, and essentially speaking, they would use the troops' backing. They'd propitiate them, they'd give them more coins, their base currency, or come up with their own currency to pay these troops by capturing mints, or so on and so forth. And they would use these troops to essentially act as functional usurpers. And so they would usurp the throne, and then another individual over here with his legions would usurp the throne from this individual. And so essentially speaking, the Roman Empire in the 3rd century devolved into a military anarchy crisis, which is the verbiage that's used by, and I apologize for what I'm doing right now. My phone's about to die, so I might have to pause this video, but I'm going to get as far as I can. I will just be watchful of this. Anyway, so essentially speaking, as the military began to realize how much power they had, and realizing that there was no clear line of succession, that the Senate was essentially powerless to do anything against them, the Praetorians and the legions began electing their own members, or their own chosen individuals, to power. And so you started having this chain of tyrannical dictators come to power during the 3rd century, to such an extent that there were dozens of emperors that came to power during the 50 years, 70 years that comprised the actual crisis era. So that's aspect 1. Aspect 2 was widespread drought in North Africa, and eventually drought in around AD 240 that led into AD 255 in Egypt, which was essentially the breadbasket of the Roman world. And so essentially, as the food stopped pouring into the empire, widespread famine came everywhere, essentially. And to accommodate for this, local farmers who still had crops to their name started practicing subsistence and localized farming practices. And given the status of Roman coinage, which had been debased to essentially uselessness by mid-240s, at earliest 230s, the Roman coinage is like 5% silver compared to what it was under Augustus. And so they weren't actually willing to reciprocate transactions with other individuals or Roman officials seeking to actually buy food for their individuals or the cities and so forth. So you didn't have any food coming into the empire, and you didn't have any food going across the empire. So it eventually follows famine, following in the lines of the logic of Gibbon, is whatever follows, or what always follows famine, is disease. And oh boy, did disease hit the Roman Empire. This is the Cyprian plague of AD 250, depending on what you read. Gibbon says it's 250. Kyle Harper, classics professor at the University of Oklahoma, thinks it's around 251. Definitively, the first contact that we had with the disease was around 247 in Metropolis in Egypt. And the only reason that we knew, now, initial estimates was that this was smallpox. However, the pathology of this disease has no markings, or, there's certain symptomatic progression that is akin to smallpox, but there's no rash or anything else. And individuals during this century would have encountered smallpox, and people during this age who actually wrote about the plague, the Bishop of Antioch and other individuals who actually saw this, were absolutely fucking terrified by this. So that sort of kind of detracts from the notion that it would, or detracts from the assertion that it would be smallpox. Kyle Harper, going back to him, again, he's a classic professor at the University of Oklahoma, and I adamantly recommend his new book, Disease, Climate, and the Fall of the Roman Empire. He essentially came to the conclusion that given the pathology of this, and given that it was wintertime and the smallpox virus does have issues surviving in the cold, or the variola virus does have evolutionary dispositions to not be survivable in the cold, given that it's an FARV, but I'm not going to get into the microbiology of this, I apologize, that it was essentially either a strain of the filiovirus family, so Ebola, hemorrhagic fevers such as that, And given the prevalence of primitive medical techniques and a lack of a Galen, so to speak, during the 3rd century, so bloodletting and things like that in contact with rodents, it wouldn't necessarily be too shocking, and it would actually essentially be logical to assume that it would be a form of Ebola during the 3rd century that actually hit. Or it was pandemic influenza. And given the disease pathology and the damage that we've seen pandemic influenza, especially influenza A, do during the Spanish flu post-World War I, it would not be surprising if that was it either, especially given the fact that this was a widespread plague. By 252, there were reports of 60% casualty rates, and not just casualty rates, like death rates in cities. The Bishop of Antioch had a census that showed 62% casualties. Another had around 39 to 48% casualties, and these were widespread, so there are multiple accounts of, I think the average casualty totals from the sources that we have across multiple cities was somewhere around 68 to 72%. So this was legit. I mean, this almost took out the empire. And it didn't just affect the Romans. I mean, the Goths encountered the plague. The Alemanni had issues with the plague. This actually comes to bite the Goths in the ass later in the 3rd century when Aurelian decides to go and clean house. But so you have a military anarchy crisis, you have no mode of secession, you have a famine, and then you have a unidentified plague that could either be influenza or Ebola actually cutting through your empire. And then, getting back to the notion of the Goths, you have widespread barbarian and Germanic invasions across the entire frontier territories. Along the 2nd century, what had essentially happened was that the Roman Empire had reached its territorial apex, and the military under Septimus Severus had grown to sizes that it had never even seen before. But the problem was that these legions were spread a little bit differently than they were normally, and so what you had was that widespread barbaric invasion, especially Germanic invasion, such as the Goths, the Franks, the Saxons along the Eastern Empire, and the Western, well, the Persians to the east, and then the Germanic tribes to the west, could essentially take advantage of the fact that most of the Roman legions were spread pretty thin, and they could dive pretty deep into Roman territory. At one point, the Alemanni almost actually penetrate deeper into Italy to the point where they actually have a swinging miss at Rome itself. This is later during Claudius's reign, but I mean, this is happening at this point. So you have widespread barbarian invasion, which is depopulating entire frontier territories, capturing or depopulating entire frontier territories, and again, that frontier territory includes farmland, defensive battlements, towns, cities, so on and so forth. By around early 258, 259, several of the provincial governors began to sort of talk amongst themselves. So this is getting into the next aspect of the crisis era. So began to talk amongst themselves that the Roman government as it stood, and especially the Roman legions themselves, weren't necessarily trustworthy to their overall safety. And these talks were especially prevalent in Lower Germany and Lower Moesia. And so Postumus, the governor of Lower Germany, kind of got the favor of the troops within his province. He led a series of successful raids against the Gothic raiding parties in Lower Germany, gaining the troops' support. And in AD 260, Postumus decided or elected to secede from the Roman Empire. So the entire eastern aspect of the Roman Empire was essentially cut off, which wasn't necessarily the worst thing that could happen, given that the Roman economy was already in shambles. They were essentially bankrupt. There was no food coming into the empire. The Germans were pouring in everywhere. There's still outbreaks of plague, even into 260. All throughout 250, plague had hit, and famine is still perniciously ongoing within the empire. By AD 270, 267 or 269, I'm forgetting this one, so this might be wrong. The Western Roman Empire, given the failure of Valerian and Gallienus to effectively combat the barbarian invasion of the new Persian threat, and with the capture, with the capture of Valerian, and Gallienus' just simple inability to properly combat. I mean, he couldn't really do anything. Gallienus gets a lot of shit, especially not from Grant. Grant gives him his due, but Herodian and Dio just absolutely go to fucking town on Gallienus. Gibbon sort of does too, but again, there wasn't much that he could do. Gallienus dies. I'm forgetting how he died. And Claudius came to power around the time that Zenobia seceded. So the East is gone. With the East, Egypt goes too. And with Egypt gone, any food, however scarce, coming into the Roman Empire is now not coming into the Roman Empire. And so, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to grab my charger. Give me just one second. So, anyways, after Zenobia seceded in 267, 269, what essentially happened is that the Roman Empire was split into thirds, coupled with everything else that had conglomerated into what we know as the crisis of the 3rd century. I came to the conclusion that by 270, or a couple months before Aurelian came to power, all of these factors combined, the secession of the empire, the military anarchy crisis, famine, economic instability or complete failure, plague, barbarian incursion, constant warfare, I essentially concluded that by AD 270 the Roman Empire had fallen. I support this by asserting that. I use everything that had happened to support that assertion. I really like the introduction of my paper. Who would have thought I liked the introduction of my paper? Dr. Murphy seemed to really like it too. He seemed to think that most of the conclusions... I'm blurry and I'm not quite sure why, but I apologize. He seemed to like the conclusions as well. He thought it was relatively well-founded. He thought people might take issue with the notion that the Roman Empire, quote, fell. He seemed to think that I might take some heat on my actual definition of fell, because typically speaking, when you use the word fall or fell in a context of history, it means that you can't necessarily come back to it. Which I agreed with him on. I said, I understand that. However, I think that given the circumstances, the Roman Empire, as we knew it in 200, no longer existed by 270. And so I think he and I came to an agreement that we could say it was a soft fall of sorts. I still hold out that it was a definitive fall, even though I had to kind of come to median agreement with my professor that it was a soft fall. Because, like I said, by 270, essentially speaking, the Roman Empire was unrecognizable, aside from the Italian-centered empire. But even then, you had Alemanni penetrating dozens of miles into Italy. The whole East, Britannia, Gaul, Spain had seceded. Palmyra or the Palmyrene Empire had seceded, and Zenobia was enacting a massive military buildup. And the Senate could do nothing, essentially. What happened was that Claudius launched a series of successful attacks on the Goths. He earned the title Gothicus Maximus in something or another. I'm forgetting the specifics of the date. I apologize. And then Claudius and his men, while camping in Sirmium, get hit with plague. Claudius expires, but upon Claudius's deathbed, Claudius elects to have Aurelian named as his successor. So Aurelian comes to power, and by now Aurelian's like the most famous general in the Roman Empire, or what was left of the Roman Empire, or if you could still call it the Roman Empire. He had been a cavalry commander adopted under the Ulpi family, so he was essential nobility. He was a commoner. He became nobility after Valerian had him adopted under the Ulpi family, which traces their lineage to Trajan. And so that explains why he was holding such a high office as an individual from relatively lowly upbringings. So Aurelian comes to power in AD 270 and essentially cleans fucking house. And when I say clean fucking house, I mean this guy annihilated the Goths, the Alemanni, the Heruli, the Jathungi, the Saxons, the Franks, reconstituted the Gallic Empire, defeated Tetricus and his legions, defeated Quintillus and his legions, defeated 2 usurpers during his reign, enacted 2 monetary policies, one of which reformulated / refabricated, revalued the coinage of the Roman Empire to almost 200% times its worth before. He enacted almost 12 new mints, 8 to a dozen new mints under his empire. He reinstituted kind of a patriotic religion reform, which I think is just absolutely amazing. What he essentially did was that using the sun god, he named himself a patron or a companion, or he himself a representative idol of Sol Invictus on earth. And with the idea being, which I concluded, I think Watson kind of hinted at it, but he never said it specifically, so I am taking credit for this. I essentially came to the conclusion that Aurelian was using Sol Invictus to essentially form a protective facade around himself. Sol Invictus, as it stood, was essentially a conglomerate of Mithras, Apollo, certain Christian elements, but it predates most of those too. So all the fucking Christians that sit there and say that Sol Invictus is a copy and paste of Jesus can go fuck themselves. And yes, you did steal Christmas on December 25th because that was the festival of the sun, fuckers. Anyways, so Aurelian was using Sol Invictus to essentially make himself an avatar of this god. And as I was saying, the behavioral attributes, or at least the associated attributes of Sol Invictus, was that he was a patron of the troops. And going back to what I said earlier about the military anarchy crisis, what exactly do you think the chances are of your legions moving to kill you, or usurpers moving to kill you, if you are claimant to being a patron of a god of the troops? He was making it seem as if that any affront to him personally was an affront to the gods themselves. And we had an early religious revival somewhere around the mid-3rd century. You typically see these with widespread epidemics and crisis eras such as this. So a lot of Romans were particularly religious, and so they bought into this. And, I mean, you have to keep in mind, too, in the Historia Augusta, you have Vopiscus or Vospicus of Syracuse essentially writing down that Aurelian killed 400 people by himself one day, and Vopiscus obviously didn't write this during when Aurelian actually ruled, but these stories circulate throughout the empire. So when you have an emperor who, during an extremely religious period, has essentially made himself a compatriot to a god of the soldiers, and yet you have this hearsay going around the empire that this individual, and the true stories going around the empire, that this individual led his troops to absolutely eviscerate a dozen or so Germanic tribes, reconstitute the Gallic Empire, conquer Syria, destroy Zenobia, reestablish trade routes, reestablish the breadbasket of Egypt, reconstitute currency, and everything else, the chances are is that you're going to have a pretty fair degree of unity within your empire. The one thing that I had difficulty coming to a decision on how I wanted to go about it is that Eusebius and Lactantius are two major Christian authors, naturally. I have particularly personal issues with the writing of Eusebius on his Testimonium Flavium and the writings of Josephus, but that's a story for another time. However, they essentially accused Aurelian near the end of his reign, around 274, during his monetary reform, after he had conquered the Palmyran Empire and he was beginning his plans to march on Asia Minor, that he was planning a massive Diocletianic-like persecution against Christians in the empire. This didn't make a lot of sense to me, but after thinking about it for quite some time, the only thing that I could come up with, given Aurelian's predisposition to reform the empire under at least a facade of unity, or the presumption of unity, and every action that he took to that point. I mean, he presided over the trial of Paul and ruled in favor of the church. So it's seemingly illogical that he would begin such a divisive tactic near the end of his reign. I mean, obviously he didn't know there was going to be the end of his reign by that point. So essentially speaking, the only conclusion that I could come up with as to why Aurelian potentially might have been a persecutor of Christians is that during his religious reformations, Sol Invictus was essentially, like I said, it was supposed to be a patriotic religion. So you could hold whatever religious beliefs that you want in the Roman Empire, so long as you accepted the fact that Sol Invictus stood over them. And that was the main idea. So you'd have Jupiter, Mercury, Mars, what the fuck ever, Mithras, Apollo, whatever you wanted to worship, the Christ god, all the other pagan deities that the Roman Empire had assimilated, but Sol Invictus stood over all of them. And if you didn't accept this, my guess is that, and you have to go back even further to how Aurelian supposedly reacted to Galenus' failure to stop the barbarian invasions. So there's a presumption that Aurelian had a hand in the assassination of Galenus, and the assumption being that Aurelian was a soldier. He cared about Rome. He cared about the safety of Rome. and he saw Gallienus as a threat to the safety of Rome. So with that in mind, I came to the conclusion that the only way that Aurelian would have ever potentially launched a persecution against the Christians is if they actually rejected the notion of Sol Invictus and were unwilling to compromise with Aurelian, and so Aurelian would undoubtedly have seen the Christians as a divisive and threatening force within his empire. Again, there's no evidence of this. There's no real evidence in Eusebius or Lactantius of anything that would lead us to believe that there was a persecution. There's definitively no physical evidence. None of the primary sources seem to say much about him being a persecutor of Christians. I can't remember if it was Zanaris or Zosimus who make a comment. Burckhardt takes Eusebius to fucking town in his book Constantine the Great as essentially being a fraud. Richard Carrier in his writings on the historicity of Jesus essentially says that Eusebius is a historical revisionist who basically makes shit up as he goes, and I'm in that camp as well, so I tried not to allow bias to interject in my paper, but I just don't see Eusebius as a trustful historian. I do understand that he is one of the most important Christian historians in the history of the church. However, there has been a shift, so to speak, in the last 50 years on our outlook of Eusebius, and I just hold the view that the majority of his histories, or his more specific aspects of his history, so especially in relation to Aurelian, simply aren't true. So I concluded my paper kind of running through everything that Aurelian did, his victories, his combat, his reforms, how he reconstituted and restored the world, so to speak, as he earned that title. And I ended my paper running through saying that, I mean, you can argue with me that this wasn't a definitive fall. However, you can't deny the fact that without Aurelian, the empire would have fallen. Plain and simple. Without Aurelian, you would have had constant influxes of barbarians. There was a massive Germanic invasion sometime during the reign of Claudius and Aurelian that would have penetrated into Rome and destroyed the Roman Empire. There was simply no way for any cohesive military strategy by the late 260s or early 270s. The economic crisis would have never gotten better, and Egypt was, or at least the Palmyrans, were mobilizing a military force. There's no definitive evidence that they were actually mobilized to make a move against Rome. However, it can't be counted out. The Gallics suffered under Claudius, but still, it was still a divided empire, and so on and so forth. So essentially speaking, my paper concluded was, I concluded on how and what started the crisis of the 3rd century, what aspects of it, blah, 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 and then I essentially concluded that without Aurelian, the empire wouldn't have survived to actually see the Diocletian reforms and the later Constantine reforms. And I also came to the conclusion, which is apparently, now that I've read more into this, a conclusion held by numerous classical scholars, that Aurelian's reforms and many of Aurelian's reforms bear striking similarities to reforms made under Diocletian. So that calls into question the originality of the Diocletianic reforms after the, I think, 4 emperors in between Aurelian and Diocletian. I think it was Carus, Tetratus. 2 of them lasted like fucking, on average, like 5 months. Postumus ruled for 6 years. Carus got hit with lightning. Then there was one more before Diocletian, and then Diocletian killed him. And then you get the dominates of the 2-part empire. But even then, when you get to the dominate, there is no clear line of succession. But so on. So that's my thesis. I submitted the first draft essentially the first week of school because I wrote the whole... It ended up being 72 pages initially. I gave it to Dr. Murphy to kind of review just syntax, structure, history-wise. And there was only one real issue during my section during the reign of Caracalla. I made a comment about what Caracalla was doing with his edict on taxes that was relatively unclear, so I had to go back and edit that. But I got the first draft back, and it was just essentially... I have a really bad problem with run-on sentences, But other than that, he said he really liked it. He said it was a very, very good thesis and that he was very impressed with it. He thought it was very well argued and meticulously researched. And he said that he was immensely happy with the first draft, and he was also immensely excited for the final draft. And so after everything was done, I added a couple sections. I made all the edits that he wanted me to or suggested me to, and then I added, I think it was 5 more pages on the economic reforms and some of the battles and shit, and some just to offer some clarity. I think the end product was 79 pages of thesis, and then 4 pages of bibliography and citations and notes and shit like that. I turned in the before final draft to just kind of go through another round of edits to my advisor on Friday. It is currently Saturday, so I am hoping to get that back within probably about, I'd say, 1 to 2 weeks. I will present, I do believe, in the interlude between Thanksgiving break and winter break. So after Thanksgiving break and before winter break. The format of the presentations is that of we present for 20 minutes and then we open the floor for 10 minutes to questions. I will probably record that and put that on YouTube. And if you guys want, you can check out my academia.edu account. I will put a link in the description. But yeah, that is my thesis and a very, very broad stroke overview of the crisis of the 3rd century and the reign of Aurelian in a nutshell. Yeah, let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you guys want to actually see the thesis, because I would more than happily record that, and I don't really think that any of my professors would have a problem with me recording that or their questions. And so with that, I am pretty fucking tired, and I didn't get to go to the gym today, which pissed me off but depresses me at the same time. So I'm going to get some sleep, ladies and gentlemen, and I will see all of you probably the next time I post a gym video. I'm not sure where that is. It might actually be a meet announcement. So stay tuned, and I will see everybody later.